The Xi Jinping era in China has begun. He takes the reins of the world's second largest economy, a nation vying to expand its influence while at the same time answering calls to become a better member of the international community. For insights into Korea's giant neighbor to the west, we turn to Professor Chung-in of Yonsei University. Professor Moon, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you.
The leadership transitions in both the U.S. and China have come to an end. We know President Barack Obama, he's been the president for the past 4 years. We don't know as much about Xi Jinping. What can you tell us about what kind of leader he is going to be over the next decade?
I think he'll be quite effective leader, and he has shown very moderate posture, yet he has a charismatic the projection. Therefore, I think he'll be a good leader, particularly compared with former president Hu Jintao. I think Xi Jinping will be much more forthcoming, but I think he will be very much constrained by domestic political changes, domestic political and economic challenges. All the issue of how to maintain sustainable development in China, and how to create so-called Xiaohuang society, the so-called well-to-do society by year 2030, and how to eradicate structural corruption in Chinese society, and how to handle growing polarization between the rich and the poor, between the urban areas and rural areas, between the coastal areas and hinterlands. Therefore, he will be facing a lot of domestic challenges.
That's quite a laundry list you just gave off there. Let's sort of go down that list a little bit. Domestically, as far as the economy goes, you mentioned some of the issues there. What is the biggest challenge that Xi Jinping is going to face domestically, economically within China over the next decade? What's the biggest thing?
The immediate challenge, which he outlined just immediate after his appointment as the leader of CCP, Chinese Communist Party, he made it very clear that how to eradicate corruption, which is extremely pervasive in Chinese society. That will be the most important challenge to him.
The question, though, is that really an attainable goal, considering the power structure there?
That will be his, that is why that will be really daunting challenge to him. But that's true. He's getting support from the Prince Club, as well as the Shanghai club, Shanghai Bang,
right.
and most of the members of those two groups are implicated in structural corruption in Chinese society. But again, if he cannot fix corruption problem, then he cannot sustain Chinese Communist Party. Chinese Communist Party will be losing legitimacy.
Is this something you talk about the factions? You've got the two opposite factions there. Is this something that we're going to see in public? Is this something that's going to come to the surface, or is all of this going to stay behind closed doors?
The Chinese leadership never shows the divisiveness on surface. Therefore, it's hold this behind the scene in the factional struggles.
Right.
But they have shown quite wise, way of settling the differences among different factions. Okay. But if you look at the composition of the standing committee of the Politburo of Chinese Communist Party, obviously there are 3 members from the Prince Clubs, okay, and 3 members from the Shanghai Bang, and 2 members from the Chinese Communist Youth Group, Youth Co. Okay, and if you look at this kind of balance, now those composition seems to be in favor of President Xi Jinping.
Okay, and there's all this talk about China being a part of the G2 now economically. Of course, they are there. It is the second largest economy now, but in other areas, not so much. And you talked a bit about them there in that list that you gave just a couple minutes ago. What does China have to do on the international stage to be sort of regarded as a quote-unquote great power moving forward?
But it's very difficult to tell, because I met President Xi Jinping in July when we had a meeting in the Tsinghua University in Beijing. But he made it his foreign policy was very clearly. Okay, he wanted to maintain peace abroad, and he wanted to maintain harmony in society, and then he wanted to really continue sustainable growth in Chinese society. But one very interesting point he made was this: he will try to protect Chinese sovereignty and territory, and will not make any kind of compromise over the issue of territory and sovereignty. Even he will risk military conflict over those issues. Given his statement, I think that he's likely to continue what Hu Jintao did for the past 10 years.
You also mentioned, though, that he is a different person. He's a different, or will be a different kind of leader than Hu Jintao. In what aspects do you see the two sort of differing?
Anyhow, Xi Jinping is a new generation. Okay, he went through the so Cultural Revolution, and he spent the Shafang. He went down all the way to the rural areas and spent those kind of times. But he's much more, in a sense, balanced, and also he speaks out. Okay, but Hu Jintao was so reserved, but Xi Jinping seems to be, he's willing to speak it out, and I think he can electrify Chinese, people too. Therefore, in the sense, he'll be somewhat different from Hu Jintao. Let me put it this way: Hu Jintao appears to be very bureaucratic, very stable bureaucrats, technocrats, but Xi Jinping can combine this, technocracy with some kind of political sense in uniting China and pushing forward China.
You're well aware. I mean, you visit China frequently, and you're obviously an expert in this field. What sense do you get from the Chinese people about this leadership transition? Do you see some enthusiasm, some encouragement that things are going to change over the next 10 years, or what's the general feeling on the ground there?
Well, it's very perplexed. Different. On the one hand, they have some kind of hope, but on the other hand, just as usual, change, because in Chinese society there's no surprise. In other words, we all know that Xi Jinping will be succeeding in Hu Jintao since past 5 years.
Right.
Therefore, everything is prepared. Nothing surprising has appeared. But Chinese people, are getting very much frustrated about their economic conditions and social conditions. For example, look at in the case of 농민공, meaning the so-called farmers who are living in the urban areas. There are more than 300 million, 농민공 in China. They are very much, frustrated. And they can be source of this, social problem in China. The Chinese Communist Party will be paying more attention to that kinds of domestic problems, like a separatist movement in Tibet and Uyghur. All those kinds of things will come out as major issues.
And is Xi Jinping the sort of leader that is going to tackle these human rights issues, or is he going to also keep the sort of the party line of the way Hu Jintao has run things? Are human rights issues going to be addressed by him?
Well, most of China watchers are now speculating that he will continue to pursue existing line.
No
Even
change.
could be more conservative Hu Jintao. Therefore, particularly when you compare with Wen Jiabao, who advocated also human rights issues and even political reform. But given the current composition of Politburo of Chinese Communist Party, I think the political reform will be somewhat slow. But still, President Xi Jinping cannot ignore the mandate of political reform. The political reform will come, but much more slower and incremental manner rather than sweeping manner.
Okay. Shifting gears a little bit to the U.S., President Obama has, of course, declared this pivot toward Asia. How do you foresee that relationship and that scenario playing out over the next, say, 10 to 15 years between China and the U.S.?
But I think it's some bad signal to the future relationship between China and the United States. Even though the President Obama hasn't named China as a target for rebalancing,
but we all
know the rebalancing against China. China seems to be somewhat unhappy about this Obama's new strategy called the pivot to Asia. Okay, but the whole point is this: can he do that? Can the U.S. come up with a financial defense budget to support his pivot to Asia? Then logic would be the strengthening alliance ties. Then more defense burden sharing by Japan, South Korea, Australia, Singapore, and other allies and friends. But if you look at the domestic political situation in those countries, it wouldn't be easy for them to come up with additional defense burden sharing. Therefore, I would see that there's some big rupture between his strategic vision and actual backup mechanism.
And China, I think, has said in the past they believe that the regional players, the people involved in the area, are eventually going to fall in line with China based on economic reasons. Is that the sense that you get, or do you see this being more of a drawn-out process where the U.S. is vying for influence here, influence there, and China, in response, is doing the same thing? I mean, how do you see the regional relationships sort of playing out there?
But I think if that is the case, it's not good for all of us. I hope
complicates everything.
I hope China and the United States should be co-partners. Henry Kissinger, in his book on China, made it very clear point. That is, China and the U.S. should be partners for co-evolution.
Okay. So
If they are in conflictual mode, all the countries in the region will suffer because they will be choosing one against the other. Therefore, if the United States push for this pivot to Asia strategy, then U.S. will be putting a lot of countries, including South Korea, in a position to pit one against the other.
So if the U.S. wants to address some of these concerns that China has, what should they do? What would the Chinese leadership like the U.S. to do to sort of ease their concerns, ease these worries that the Chinese leadership have? What can the U.S. do?
Yet, go back to the Obama administration, okay? And particularly even look at the latter part of the Bush administration. Robert Jellick went to Beijing and he proposed the idea of a stakeholdership between China and the United States. It was very well received in China. And also Obama continued the tradition in the first, in his first administration. Therefore, just respect China, have a more dialogue and cooperation with China, don't regard China as a threat, okay? And I think that is the best way to build a partnership for co-evolution that can benefit all the countries in the region.
How would you rate the possibility of some sort of confrontation between the U.S. and China in the coming months or years?
There is obviously, East China Sea and South China Sea, all this Jiangkaku Island, or what Chinese call the Taoidao, and then, so Xisha, Nansha Islands in the South China Sea. If there are any kinds of so-called conflict, particularly between, let's say, over the Senkaku Island, Taoidao, if there is a conflict between Japan and China, then it is inevitable for the U.S. okay, not to involve in the situation. Then eventually that will lead to the confrontation between China and the United States. But we do not want to see that kind of escalation in the region.
And the U.S. has been very hesitant, thus far at least, to sort of get involved in these territorial disputes. They're pretty much hands-off, so we'll see how that develops as time goes on. We've been talking about the U.S. and China. Let's talk about Korea as it pertains to the U.S. and China. They could be a bit hard-pressed to keep a neutral stance as time goes on between the U.S. and China. Interests, of course, with both countries. What role do you think Korea is going to play moving forward in trying to balance out its interests with both countries?
But for us, there is one issue. If we can resolve North Korean problem, if you improve ties with North Korea, then that can open for the opportunities to balance diplomacy. If you go back then if you improve ties with North Korea, okay, then we'll be less dependency on military alliance with the United States. Then that will make China happy. And also then we can influence China in Chinese policy on North Korea. Then that can create a so-called virtuous cycle among inter-Korean relations, allocate U.S. relations, and allocate China relations.
So the first step would be South Korea bettering relations with North Korea and then use that as a sort of a launching point to, in turn, ease the tensions with the U.S. and China and sort of find a middle ground is what you're saying.
Precisely.
Yeah. And we talked about Korea's unique position being in between sort of the China and the U.S. and their interests. How are China and the U.S. utilizing South Korea, and how should they utilize South Korea?
Yeah, as you can see, that the United States has been trying to persuade South Korea to be part of its pivot to Asia. So that the United States has been emphasizing the importance of trilateral coordination and cooperation among the U.S., Japan, and South Korea. Okay, obvious target is China. But on the other hand, China wants South Korea to get away from that kind of so-called setting. So China wants South Korea to improve its ties with North Korea, to have a more balanced position vis-a-vis China and the United States. Okay? Because, for example, the whole issue of missile defense, okay? China is really fearful of South Korea joining U.S., Japan initiated so-called missile defense in the theater. Therefore, that is kind of the so-called conflicting, interests of the United States and China. Therefore, we should be very, very, prudent in resolving these kinds of conflicting interests between China and the United States.
Using communication and imagination, perhaps.
Yeah, precisely, yeah.
And what sorts of diplomatic capabilities will the next leader of South Korea need to handle all of these complicated matters?
The most important asset will be imagination, diplomatic imagination. If a new leader of South Korea continue to rely on old inertia, then we cannot come up with diplomatic breakthrough. Therefore, we need a leader with a new imagination. And another important requirement is the new leader's ability to show balance and moderation, what we Koreans call Chung-in, mean. Okay? Therefore, if leader becomes excessively tilted toward one actor against another actor, that can create imbalances, that can undercut stability on the Korean Peninsula in Northeast Asia. And third important one is ability to form national consensus. Okay? Foreign policy is an extension of domestic politics. If you cannot forge national consensus, then any kind of foreign policy without national consensus is bound to fail. Therefore, it is very important for new leader to forge national consensus to back up foreign policy initiatives.
And you use this word imagination. I'm curious, from your perspective, what does that mean exactly? What sort of imagination are they going to need to handle these complicated matters? What does that mean exactly?
No, for example, look at the European theater. Okay, look, in early 1950s, there are such leaders as Charles de Gaulle, Adenauer, and Jean Monnet, Robert Schuman. They just get out of such a protracted and tragic war, yet they began to talk about European integration. That kind of efforts would have never been possible without having political imagination and diplomatic imagination. Therefore, I hope our new leader would come up with that kinds of diplomatic imagination so that he can really initiate new discourses on cooperation and integration in Northeast Asia.
We've also heard that important figures in the Chinese government are quote-unquote pro-Korea. Now, I wonder what exactly that means. What are you
But
hearing?
the Korean news media and some China experts in South Korea have been telling people that the members of Standing Committee of Politburo have been frequenting South Korea quite often. Like Xi Jinping, he visited South Korea several times. Li Keqiang, the new prime minister, has been visiting South Korea quite often. Therefore, out of that one, those pundits have been arguing that the new leadership in China has more understanding of South Korea. Therefore, they're expecting there will be better relationship between China and South Korea.
Are there any drawbacks, though, to having a Chinese leadership that is so knowledgeable about South Korea? Are there any drawbacks to that?
No, having friendship is one thing, and figuring out national interest is another. Therefore, no matter how they are closer to South Korea, Chinese leadership will pursue policy in accordance with their own national interests.
And the presidential elections coming up, obviously, we have the candidates here who are all talking about North Korea and bettering relations with them. That is something that you are saying is the best thing to do right now, is to start from there and move on forward to help things with China as well.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Do we have any indications, though, that Xi Jinping is going to deal any differently with North Korea than Hu Jintao or any of his other predecessors?
I don't think so. And also, as a matter of fact, Xi Jinping is much closer to North Korea than to South Korea. He's the person who said that the Korean War as a just war for Chinese, because what Chinese described the Korean War as anti-American and assisting North Korean war. Okay, and in view of that one, if Xi Jinping understands the Korean War as a just war in which China sent a large number of voluntary forces, okay, then that tells something. Therefore, I would say that China would like to maintain stability on the Korean Peninsula. Even emphasis on stability would come first, then emphasis on the nuclear issues. Therefore, in that sense, that either Chinese leadership is likely to continue existing policy on North Korea.
No change.
I don't see any abrupt change.
And looking at how they've handled these maritime disputes in the South China Sea and East Sea as well thus far, what can we expect from China moving forward? I mean, any changes on that as well, or do you see them doing the same thing they've been doing now and trying to expand their influence in those regions?
But I really don't think it is really expansion of influence, but it is rather their claim on territory and its sovereignty, because it has something to do with 100 years of history of humiliation and subjugation. Therefore, claiming its own entitlement to the Dao, Senkaku Island, has something to do with the historical past. Therefore, it will be very difficult for the Chinese leadership to make a compromise or concession on that issue. Therefore, the situation will continue for the time being. Then I think Japanese leadership and Chinese leadership should sit together, should come up with some kind of peaceful manner to resolve the current issue.
And it's certainly an interesting topic because on one hand we have all three countries, Japan, China, and Korea, talking about this trilateral free trade agreement, but at the same time we've got all of these tensions surrounding diplomacy and the territorial disputes. In the long run, these three countries, Japan, China, and Korea, do you see the relationship going south in any way? I mean, what scenario would worsen relations between those neighbors there?
But given the past history of domination and subjugation, it is very difficult for Chinese and South Koreans or North Koreans to forget past history. They have a collective memory of past history. Therefore, the sources of conflict coming from this past history and national identity will continue. On the other hand, there will be increasing level of economic, social, and cultural interdependence. Therefore, if you look at the situation in Northeast Asia, conflict and cooperation cohabitate. That what political leadership should do is to minimize conflict while maximizing cooperation. In that way, we can avoid any kinds of flashpoint in the region.
And in that regard, I suppose it is encouraging to know that those relations are there and that there is a way to a better path to diplomacy. So that is something to sort of hang our hat on and look forward to as we move forward. Unfortunately, Professor Moon, we are out of time, but we do appreciate you coming in today.
My pleasure.
Professor Moon Chung-in of Yonsei University. And that does it for us today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on After 10.